I remember my wife used to make lists of things to do, and she would check them off as she got them done. She was just a great list maker. My children remember that. My children, some of them make lists of things to do. Somehow or another, we seem to like this type of thing. A number of years ago, I took 2 seminars in time management. I'm not sure just whether or not that did me any good, but nevertheless, that's what I had. And they said, make a list. Make a list of things that are important, things that are of medium importance, things that are of lesser importance, and then when you get the first 2 sections done, the last section will probably take care of itself. Paul was a great man for making lists. He made lists of things to do and not to do when he wrote to the Colossians, when he wrote to the Ephesians, when he wrote to the Galatians, when he wrote to the Romans, when he wrote to the Corinthians. He made lists. Do this, don't do that. They come under various categories or names, but tonight I want to look for a final look, by the way, at the 12th chapter of Romans. And just simply look at what Paul said about things to do and things not to do in our lives. So this is just a sermon based on a list of things. We've taken the 12th chapter of Romans in sections for about the last few weeks, and periodically I've spoken on those things. In the reading that we had just a moment ago, if I counted correctly, we have about 10 things to do and about 6 things not to do. Nothing new here. They're not all easy, by the way. Some of them we think of as rather easy, but some of them are pretty difficult for us to think about. So in the 14th verse, he begins by saying, bless those who persecute you. A little easy. We are really not under persecution, I don't think. Nobody that I know of has been put in jail here in the United States because he is a Christian. Nobody's been killed or martyred or anything like that in the United States because he's a Christian. The people to whom Paul wrote were not quite that fortunate. The emperors were not favorable toward Christianity at all. Doesn't apply to us. No, I don't think it does at all. I don't think that it means that at all. But it does mean those who oppose us, whether it's in form of persecution or whatever it might be. We don't like to be opposed. We don't like for people to fight against us. We don't like for people to speak against us. We want things to go along the way we want them to go along, you know. Well, when we meet this opposition, what do we do about it? Paul says, bless those people. And then he gives the reverse. He says, bless and do not curse. Well, I don't think we're going to pronounce curses on anybody. I'm not sure that does any good anyway. But I doubt if we're going to pronounce curses on anybody. What is his message? I think his message is just this, that accomplish more by many years ago wrote a book called How to Win Friends and Influence People. And one chapter in that book, I think the title of it was, Don't Turn Over the Beehive. Pretty tricky title. And the idea of don't turn over the beehive is saying that the bees are dangerous. So why don't you be nice to them? There used to be a man over at Glendale who was a beekeeper. And, he put on his garb and protect himself and so forth. But at the same time, you see pictures in newspapers and in magazines of where people will allow the bees just to light on them, and their whole face will be covered. I'm not a real fan of that, to tell you the truth. But the point is that even though the bees have the capacity to hurt, if we're nice to them, the chances are they won't hurt. So I think that for us in our contemporary world today, for us, the message of Don't fight against persecution. Instead, bless those who persecute you. The message really is, be helpful to people, even though those people oppose you. Dale Carnegie also said this, I think in that same chapter in the book. It's been many years since I read it, but he said something about people, bosses get more done out of their employees by praising them than by criticizing them. If you want to make a child feel inferior, feel like I'm worthless, tell that child for a long time, you're a bad child. You're a bad girl. You're a bad boy. People don't like you, do they? And the first thing you know, the child will say, yes, I guess I've got to live up to that kind of reputation. That's apparently what I am. So those who are opposed to us, bless them. Don't curse them. Help them. Don't hinder them. The next thing he says is rejoice with those who rejoice. Well, I remember reading something where a commentator said, that's harder than the other one. Weep with those who weep. I'm not sure that I would agree with that. I think that both of these might be very, very difficult, though. Sometime we find it difficult to enjoy the pleasures of someone else. For example, if I'm playing football or baseball or basketball or something like that, and the other team wins and they're rejoicing, I might find it a little bit hard. They just beat us. I might find it a little bit difficult to go over and congratulate them because it's at my expense that they're rejoicing. Wouldn't it be an interesting thing? Now, we have the Super Bowl coming up, and we have the playoffs and all this sort of thing. Wouldn't it be an interesting thing if the losing team, the whole bench got up and ran across the field, to the winning team, shook hands with them and congratulated them on what a good game they played? Well, there's some of that goes on, but not very much. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Sometimes that's hard too, isn't it? A number of years ago, my brother-in-law in Nashville, Tennessee, died after open heart surgery. He never woke up. My wife, my sister, of course, was absolutely devastated, and she had a hard time facing things the way they were. When they had the wake or the visitation and so forth, different names in different places for things like this. But when they had this, she said she was not going to go. And there was her husband, and people were going to come and so forth. Finally, she decided that she would go and sit there. It was very, very difficult for her. She went to a pretty large congregation there in Nashville, Tennessee, and about 200 people from that congregation came that night. What were they saying to her? They really were saying, we've rejoiced with you when you rejoiced, and now we've come to weep with you while you weep. People who are in sorrow make such dynamic connections with other people who feel their sorrow. I might not know exactly what it's like. I might not have experienced that particular sorrow myself, but just for folks to know that I am trying to sympathize, I'm trying to empathize, I'm trying to be a part of your sorrow. Or as Paul says to the Galatians, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And then he says, live harmonious Live harmoniously with other people. As much as in you lieth, be at peace with other people. He uses both of these expressions. Get along with folks. Our tendency is what? When someone insults us, we can insult them. We fight back. We retaliate. A little bit more about that in just a moment. Instead, Paul says here that we are to learn to live harmoniously with our fellow men. Notice what it says, live in harmony with one another. Now this was said to the church. I don't think he's just talking about unity within the congregation. I think instead he's talking about unity in our lives. Live harmoniously. Learn to get along with people. Do you agree with everything that they say? No. My goodness, I don't even agree with myself sometimes, you know. I have conflicts within myself about I should or I should not. And we all experience that. And when someone differs with us, instead of feeling like I've got to win, Paul says, live harmoniously. No, we don't really have to win. We may win that battle, but we may lose that war too, you know. And so Paul says, live harmoniously with one another. Then he gives us another one. He says, don't be proud. Don't be proud. There's something about this that's a little bit contradictory. Pride is a very important thing. And for a person to take pride, for example, in his work is a very important thing, isn't it? I did this, I'm very proud of what I've done. That's okay. But then there's another aspect of pride that we think of as arrogance. There's still another aspect of it that we think of as snobbishness. An arrogant, snobbish, proud person. What is the difference here? In one situation where I am saying, I did this and I'm proud of what I've done. I made this. I crafted this. I'm proud of what I've done. That simply says that there's a self-esteem that is within me that says, yes, I have a right. I have a right to be proud of what I've done here. Otherwise, I begin doubting myself. Some people can never take a compliment. They never feel like they're quite up to everybody else. And if they're in a group of people, they kind of sit in the corner. They don't say anything much because they have this feeling of inferiority. And the Bible encourages us to realize that we are the creation of God. You and I are the creations of God. We're made in God's own image. And it's just like the cartoon that I've mentioned so many times. It really meant something to me. The little boy says, I know I'm worth something because God don't make no junk. And that's really the way it is. But what Paul is talking about here when he says, don't be filled with pride, he's talking about this arrogance that I'm better than you. I'm smarter than you. I know more. I'm more skillful than you. I'm better looking than you. I better quit talking about this, hadn't I? Yeah. When we begin thinking of ourselves in that way, that's harmful. It's interesting to me that earlier in this same chapter, Paul says, I say to everyone among you not to think of himself, what's the rest of that verse? More highly than he ought to think. So he basically says, find the balance in your life. Find the balance between thinking well of yourself and not allowing that to go to your head and be conceited. After he says this, he says that. Well, I got to find my place here again. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Well, I don't like that. I would rather associate with people on the same level as I am. The same education level, the same cultural level, the same financial level. That's what I'd rather do. Paul says, you're missing something here, because this really is an arrogant thing. Learn to associate with people of low degree. He's not talking about associating with evil people. Instead, he's talking about the fact that you and I need to learn to be people, so that we are willing to associate with people who are poorly educated if we are highly educated, people who are maybe disabled when we are not disabled, people that need our help. He says, learn to associate with people of lower degree in these things. He's not deprecating the position of people and say, well, you're up here and they're down here, and so condescend to them. No, he's saying instead, learn to be a part of everybody. That's not an easy thing to do, because generally speaking, we like to associate with people that we're most like, don't we? But Paul says, learn to do this other just as well. Well, the next thing he says goes right along with this. Don't be conceited. Don't be conceited. Isn't it interesting much about how you feel about yourself? Don't be proud. More highly than you ought to think. The Bible says so much about the importance of having a balanced thought about yourself. It's like this fellow said, fortunately this fellow was kidding. He said, Jack, you don't have an inferiority complex. You really are inferior. It's not a complex at all. Well, you know, the whole idea is we are the creation of God. And we need to balance this idea of pride and conceit with the idea of being willing to associate with people of lower degree. The next thing that Paul says is that we're to learn to do what's right in the eyes of other people. That isn't always easy to decide. Is Paul saying compromise, always do it their way? No. Is Paul saying that we need to learn to get along with people, therefore to do things that please other people? Well, some of us feel like we ought not to be people pleasers. We ought to, you know, the song, there's a beautiful, beautiful song. The words are terrible. The words are really bad. I think it was Frank Sinatra that sang the song years ago. I Did It My Way. I remember that song, and I looked at the words. I played the ukulele, and I was working on a little ukulele thing there. I thought of that song. I thought, I'm going to go get the words, you know, and I read the words. I had heard them before, but I'd forgotten them. But I read the words, and, you know, here's this arrogant man. I may be bloody and all this sort of thing, but I did it my way. And there's a poem called Invictus. And it ends up, it's a beautiful poem, but it ends up by saying, I am the captain of my fate. I am the master of my soul. No, you're not. We're not that way. In this whole thing, Paul says, learn to be people pleasers. I think as we begin the new year, some of these things can become kind of our New Year's resolutions here. The last part of this whole thing is, beginning with the 17th verse, is probably the climax of all of it. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what's right in the eyes of everybody. If it be possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everybody. Don't take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. Paul's not talking about self-defense. Paul is not talking about turning the other cheek. Paul is talking about vengeance. There's a difference in protecting oneself and protecting one's family and the idea of taking vengeance. I don't have any right to take vengeance, Paul says, on the other person. I think that this is a very difficult thing for us to make a demarcation here. What's the difference between defending and taking vengeance? Defending is something that we do when someone has attacked us and is injuring us. Vengeance is getting back at people. It's like the little sign of my neighbor across the street where I lived at one time in the San Fernando Valley. He had a little sign on his fence. It said, you know, people have beware the dog and all that. Well, his sign said, never mind the dog, beware of the owner. So, but the whole idea, of course, it was a joke, of course, but the whole idea is that we live in a society that says, I have the right to retaliate. I have the right to take vengeance. If you do something bad to me, I have the right to do something bad to you. You see, emphasis on my rights leads to demands. Emphasis on personal responsibility leads to service. I think that's very important because we live in a culture that says so much of the time you have this right and that right and another right, and it leads us down the wrong paths. And the first thing you know, we feel that we have the right to avenge, the right to fight back. Not in self-defense, but to get the other fella, to punish the other fella. And Paul says, don't do that. And he talks about your enemy. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's athirst, give him to drink. And then he says, by so doing, you heap coals of fire upon his head. You know the story of the little girl. Her little friend had done something really bad to her, and she went and told her mother, and then she says, I want to take these cookies over to her. And her mother says, why do you want to do that? She says, well, the Bible says if I be nice to her, God will heap coals of fire on her head. And so maybe the motive there was a little bit wrong. Children teach us a wonderful lesson along this line sometime. My little nephew, well, when he was a little guy, he had a friend by the name of Greg. And he and Greg were outside playing one spring afternoon, and they were out there playing. They got into a scuffle and everything, and the first thing you know, Charlie came in crying, and his father said, Charlie, what's the matter? Greg hit me. Well, he got over that. In a few minutes, we decided we'd go out and buy a kite. I always liked kites. We went out and bought a kite, brought it home, and we were getting ready, we're putting it together, you know, and just all this sort of thing. And Charlie jumped up and he says, I want to go get Greg. You know what my reaction was? What do you want to get him for? He just hit you. You know? Now, he had forgotten about that. And little children teach us a good lesson along that line. Yes, they get in scuffles. Yes, they fuss and fight. But so much of the time they're so forgiving. And so Paul says, wrath, revenge, That's God's prerogative, not mine. So he says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's athirst, give him to drink. For in so doing you shall heap coals of fire upon his head, and be not overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. Boy, that's a hard one, isn't it? That's really a hard one. This, in a sense, I think of it this way. This is not a command. This is a way of life. It's the way we begin thinking about what my life ought to be. It isn't like the little girl who said, I will do good for her because God will take care of the vengeance. That isn't the idea. The idea is that I need to learn to become that kind of person. And so this list of do's and don'ts is not so much a group of commandments as it is Paul is describing here the personality that we need to develop, the mode of thought that we need to develop. What are we going to be like? And here are some things that we can learn and be like. Now, I want to turn, as we close, to the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. I want to read that because these two have something in common that I think is very, very important. And that is that in this love chapter of the Bible, as it's called, Paul tells us something about love. He doesn't define it. He doesn't give us a list of things to do in the sense of if you do this, do this, do this, do this, then you're a person of love. No, that's not it. But he describes what the personality of love really is. And listen to what he says, beginning with verse 4. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love doesn't envy. It doesn't boast. It's not proud. It's not rude. It's not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Oh boy, don't you wish that was not in there? Keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but it rejoices in truth. It always protects. It always trusts. It always hopes. It always perseveres. Love never fails. Most of the time. No, that's not there, is it? Love never fails. Is he trying to tell us, here's the definition of love? No. Is he trying to tell us, if we do these things, we are then automatically people of love? No. What he's trying to say is, this is the person of love. This is the kind of person that you want to become, that you need to become. Just like as Paul lists these things that we talked about a moment ago in Romans 12. He's not saying, you will be acceptable to God by doing this and this and this and this. We can teach monkeys to do a lot of things, you know. He's saying instead, learn to be this kind of person. If you're not a Christian tonight, this is a wonderful time to become a child of God. We're going to sing an invitation song, and as we sing, if you have any need that we can help you with, we invite you to come. Let's stand together and sing, please.